Good afternoon and welcome to the Seven Hills Fellowship Tuesday devotional. For those of you who have been tuning in for a while now, you know that what I've been doing is interviewing people and asking them to share their stories of suffering, but how in those stories of suffering, how God sustained them, how he strengthened them, how he buoyed them. And so today we've got Laura Elmer with us. So Laura very bravely and humbly is offering to share just a little piece of her story. And so Laura, if I may, let me go ahead and just turn it over to you. You can introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your story, a little bit about your suffering, and a little bit about how God strengthened you in the midst of that.
Hey everybody, I am Laura. As BP said, I am married to David Elmer. He works at Berry and we have two awesome kids. I am going to kind of tell two bits of my life that talk about suffering today. I went to Auburn, and it's important to know that I became a Christian when I was really young. I had a really safe, sort of charmed, privileged home life and didn't experience a lot of suffering until I got to college. And then I had a season where I had a close friend diagnosed with cancer. I lost two high school friends. And then I had a friend taken out of her home while she was studying, driven to an ATM, forced at gunpoint to take all of the money out of her account, and then shot in the head and left in the street. And that season of my life was absolutely shocking. I had been very protected, and so it was just turmoil in my faith and in my life. And luckily, I had an RUF minister and his wife at that point in my life who just let me rip into them with the hardest questions about suffering and loss and how God could be a good God and how he could love me and how all those things could happen. Luckily, really amazing, David Elmer was walking with me through that point in my life as well. And he walked through all of that with me. And so we ended up getting married. That minister married us. And it was a point in my life that I really felt like I got to know God better than ever. But my experiences with suffering have not necessarily been pretty faith experiences. I have often really loved the picture of Jacob wrestling with God and having to, get his hip pulled out of his socket to realize that God is the powerful one. And that sort of fast forward to David and I being married for 5 years, we decided to start trying to have children. And we were really excited. And I got pregnant right away. I know that infertility and stuff is a hard topic for a lot of people. And I know these experiences are really different on every end. So I want to acknowledge that up front. So in my journey, it was very easy to get pregnant, but I could not keep pregnancies. And so I was excited right away that I was pregnant. And it was about 9 weeks later that I lost my first baby. At that point, I was pretty hopeful because I got pregnant so fast that, this is sad. I am disappointed, but I trust God. And so we tried again, and I got pregnant again, and I was pregnant longer this time and lost the baby again. And, through our time trying to have kids, we do now have two wonderful children, as I mentioned at the beginning. But I have lost 4 children in this process. And the hope and the trust has wavered along the way. And so that is sort of my story that I wanted to share about suffering. And I'm really excited to sort of share how I walked with God and how he was with me in those moments.
So first of all, let me just say thank you for sharing that. I cannot imagine how heartbreaking that was, and probably is actually still. I can only imagine. What was going on in your head and your heart during those moments of losing children? What was going on inside of you at those moments?
I think there's a lot of different sort of types of trauma I think you experience with miscarriages, because there is obviously the loss of life, but there's also a lot of physical trauma too. Um, so just, feeling terrible physically, while also anger, and then your hormones are crazy and out of control. Um, like your actual biological imbalance is really messed up. And so it can just be a time where you feel like you're riding the ocean. But I will say that experiencing the loss that I did in college, that was so tragic and so sudden and so unexpected. I'm trying to think about exactly how to say it. I think one of the ways that God has really been with me was I really connected with the story of Joseph in that first season of my life. A man who was sold into slavery, hated by his siblings, wrongfully accused, forgotten in prison. And all along the way, there's like these moments in scripture where it says, and God was with him, and it talks about God's love for him. And I clung to those moments because I'm like, he had to be so mad at God too.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that I'm not, I know I've been listening to some of these devotions, and I haven't necessarily, as other people, I think in moments of miscarriage, sometimes people's sort of immediacy to swipe God's sovereignty or God's plan or those things hit me the wrong way. Yep. In my suffering. Yep. I believe them with my head. I know them with my head, and I want to believe them with my heart, but it's not what I wanted to hear. Right. In moments in either time of my life. And so in both of those times, I have felt like I have connected more with biblical characters than I have with specific scripture. So another thing that has really just spoken to my heart was the ways in which Jesus was with Mary and Martha in their grief. He didn't force them ahead to like, I'm about to bring him back from the dead. Like, you don't actually even have to be sad here. He met them in their specific needs and specific grief. Right. And like even, wept with them. And so I loved how, each sister needed something different. And I just love that he didn't hustle them to healing, right. Or, I've got the bigger story. The bigger story is the most important thing. You just need to skip over these feelings. That is not the way Jesus engaged with them. Yeah. At all. And so I guess in, experiencing sort of this season of up and down, excitement and loss, trying to trust that like my children are not for my own gain anyways. They are, God's children. And even, Elliot and Maggie, I have to like lay them at the feet of the cross and say, Lord, these are your kids. And so I think in those seasons I have, it sounds silly to say like not specific scripture, but like biblical characters, or even in Hebrews 11, when it talks about, some people call that like the Faith Hall of Fame or something. Yeah. Where they list a bunch of Old Testament people who experienced stuff, did like awesome things walking with God, but also experienced really hard stuff. I think there's even a line that says something about, but they did not see what was promised. Right, right. And I think that diving into scripture and saying like, even David in Psalm 88 is, like darkness is my companion, recognizing like it is okay in suffering
Mhm.
to suffer, and you don't have to like clean up to walk with God in the midst of really terrible stuff. Like
Yeah.
you can just be angry and feel all the things, and sometimes feel lonely and be like, God, tell
Mhm.
me that you're here.
Yep.
And so I think that God has been with me,
Right.
uh, but it has not always looked picture perfect in those moments.
I love, I think it's interesting you mentioned Psalm 88. I love Psalm 88. There are three Psalms that do not end with resolution, and Psalm 88 is one of those. So, to your point, exactly, God said, for those of you who cannot see the end, I'm going to give you this worship psalm that ends without resolution. It
Yeah,
ends in darkness. And part of what I love about that psalm too is that the psalmist is still talking to God. Does that make sense?
mhm.
And so there's no resolution, but there's still a relationship, even if it's one of anger.
Right. Yeah. And I think that is in my seasons of suffering. Um, I think when I mentioned that I grew up a Christian and was in sort of a easy childhood in some sense of the word. I think I had a notion that when suffering came, that I would be Pollyanna. Uh, and I think maybe that's because I loved that movie and I have some personality traits that are similar, but that I wouldn't fall apart in
Yeah.
essence. And I have found so much healing in falling apart and recognizing that God does not stop loving me when I am falling apart, or when I'm angry. Like I don't have to perform for him to love me. I can come as low as I am.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, Psalm 88 is sometimes I feel like I was screaming it.
Right. Absolutely.
um, so yeah, and so miscarriage is one of those things. Infertility is one of those things where you have a lot of expectation and um, yeah, where you really feel like you don't get a lot of answers
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
why. And it's interesting to even like talk about some of that stuff like with my kids now, or there are strange conversations that come up when people are chatting with you that sort of trigger like, how many kids are you going to have? And I say to our church family, don't feel bad if you ask me those questions, but don't feel bad if you ask any of those questions. But it is this thing where it's like, I don't have a lot of answers. And I just, have to say like, there's something about like, did not see what was promised that is just really something that
Yeah.
spoke to my soul, because I have seen the love story of the Bible in its entirety. And I do know that God does love us, but we don't always get to see
Yeah.
why things are
Yeah.
the way they are.
Oh, okay. That is a perfect place to end. That's fantastic. Man, Laura, thank you so much for sharing that story. It is a privilege to be able to be invited in and for you to share not only the suffering, but also the hope. And I think that's a fantastic message for our people to hear. So thank you so much for sharing that. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. And I just will put a plug out there that if there's someone suffering with similar things, they can be hard things to talk about. And my phone number is in the planning directory. So call me.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for that too. All right. Thank you very much, Laura. We appreciate it. And we'll have you back if that's okay.
That sounds great. Okay, bye bye.